the one thing that mostly surprises people when I bring it up is I actually play the bagpipes. So that's one of the weird hidden talents I have.
Welcome to Threat Vector, a podcast where Unit 42 shares unique threat intelligence insights, new threat actor TTPs, and real-world case studies. Unit 42 has a global team of threat intelligence experts, incident responders, and proactive security consultants dedicated to safeguarding our digital world. I'm your host, David Moulton, Director of Thought Leadership for Unit 42. Today, I have a truly inspiring guest, Donnie Hasseltine, Vice President of Security at Second Front and a former Recon Marine who has successfully navigated the transition from military leadership to steering cybersecurity in a fast-paced world of Silicon Valley. Today, I'll share our conversation, which covers Donnie's unique perspectives on what military experience brings to cybersecurity, the critical importance of foundational security practices for startups, and how to cultivate the security mindset essential for today's digital defenders. If you're a veteran looking to pivot into tech, Donnie shares some advice for you toward the end. If you're a startup founder seeking to embed security into your DNA or just fascinated by the intersection of technology and security, this conversation is for you. So let's dive in. Donnie, talk to me about your journey from being the Recon Marine to leading security efforts in the tech industry, and specifically within a startup.
Yeah, no, it was a fairly interesting journey. I mean, I spent over 22 years in the Marine Corps. I was in infantry and combat arms and recon as a battalion commander in the later stages of my career. And, I was thinking that I was going to stay in and go down that road. But I think two things kind of impacted that, a little bit of some family decisions. But second of all, my last duty station was up here in Silicon Valley. So in doing that, I got involved in Hacking for Defense, which is a Stanford run program. It's in multiple universities now that takes the lean launchpad and applies it to DoD problems. And I started seeing areas where some of the problems I saw in the military, right, were actually could be solved through commercial tech or creative MVPs, minimum viable products. And in doing that, I started looking like, okay, what are the things we can do on the military side? That led me to start digging a little deeper into cybersecurity because, in my time, both in exercises and combat, the further we've gone along in my career and even now, you've seen how it may be great if you can maneuver on the battlefield and use combined arms and things like that, but you have to control the electromagnetic spectrum, and you've got to integrate that into your more physical and kinetic approaches in combat. And I found that in a lot of cases, the senior leaders just didn't have that exact background they needed to be able to integrate that. So I went and did a master's in cybersecurity through Brown University. And in doing that, started kind of exploring that further and further, which led me to decide to get out and step in the private sector. And when I did, my first role in the private sector was a small PE firm that was doing B2B SaaS turnarounds. And as you can imagine, if you're taking a SaaS company that's has flatlined or struggled or has other issues there, if they have issues in the business side, they also have issues in the security side. So built out a cybersecurity program, helped run some of those companies for that firm, and then stepped into where I'm at now at Second Front Systems.
And when you and I were talking before the show, you mentioned the way that you went from your moment in the military into those programs. I thought it was really interesting, and I want to call it out here.
Yeah.
Can you tell the audience what caught your eye? What caught your ear?
Yeah, so obviously the thing that pushed me towards that master's at cybersecurity was an NPR ad. I was driving home from work, listening to NPR, and there was an advertisement from Brown's Executive Masters in Cybersecurity program. I'm like, maybe I should give that a shot. And applied, got in, and that kind of was the first step that really took me down this path. So
shout out to the folks at Brown who figured out that they needed to run their cybersecurity program ads on NPR to reach out to my friend and yours, Donnie, to get him into that program. You're in startup world now. You're working as the lead for security for the business. And I'm wondering, how did your military background prepare you for that role? They're very different, but I expect that there's some sort of overlaps.
One of the things I noticed, from the military to cybersecurity is really the mindset. So we talk a lot of times about the security mindset and things like that, and how you look at problems essentially. And in my Brown class, I remember there was a great time where I was like watching how people reacting to things that are being presented out there. And, even to take a very acute example, like we had a physical security portion, obviously. And at one point, we were talking about different locks and structures and passing those around. And one of my colleagues, I look over and she's picking the lock. I'm like, were they passing lock picking kits around? She's like, no, I just have one. I'm like, why do you carry that? I'm like, why not? Right. And it struck me that even though nobody really in the class had a military background, a few did, they all had the same mindset, which was every time I look at something, I can break that, I can get around that kind of hacking mindset. And I think that's incredibly valuable in cybersecurity and really hard to teach. The technical skills can be taught. The
Yeah.
specifics on how you do things can be taught. But that mindset of where you just kind of have a slightly paranoid look at everything you see and you question, like, how do I break that? How do I get around that? Or how can that be done? That's a key mindset that we actively try to teach in our Marines on how do they achieve mission, how to get through obstacles. And I think that is really the most immediately transferable skill when you take veterans and you put them in a cybersecurity space.
So, how to break things where its weaknesses are, understanding that just because you were told something works in a particular way isn't entirely true and isn't the
Absolutely.
end of the story. Yeah, that's fascinating. It's certainly one of the things that I've heard from some of the veterans here at Palo Alto that have transferred over from service into the private sector that gives them a leg up. Um, where does that come from? You said train into the Marines, but I wonder, is there a particular culture, kind of person? Do you have any observations on that?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's difficult because I do think, I guess I kind of contradict myself, right? I said it's hard to train, but like we do train it in there. I think part of it is how are you living it, essentially? When you talk about like individuals in the military, they're constantly given very difficult, challenging situations or no win situations. They have to find a way through those, right? And I think that, especially if you're talking about combat situations where people's lives depend on it, it really activates your mind and your survival instincts in a different way that's not normally activated on a day-to-day basis. And I think as that occurs, you start to it pushes you to think about things in a different way. And I think that environment where there's constantly a very high pressure, there's constantly a perspective of there's obstacles in front of you and you
Hmm.
have no choice but to get around them. You'd have the choice of like, well, I'll deal with that tomorrow. You have to do it now. I think that's the piece that kind of like crystallizes and catalyzes that mindset in the military. And I think that, not to say it doesn't exist in the private sector. Some of my best, security teammates have no military experience, but they have that kind of specific, je ne sais quoi, like quality about it, where they think about that in that same way of addressing problems and obstacles.
So I hear you saying that there's this idea of seeing something that is both urgent and important, right? Upper right hand quadrant
Right.
on a two up. And how do you find those people? How do you interview for them? Maybe part of it is that you shortcut by looking, or are they a veteran? But are there other ways that you can suss that out when you're looking for a good security team?
Yeah, I think one, you can look at like what their background was. That's, I mean, the basic thing. But I think in interviews, when you're talking through them, you can sometimes figure that out by giving them technical challenges to see how they think about things. And I'm also a big fan of like the scenario based things. Like, give me an example, walk me through how you saw something like that from your background. Because a lot of cases, what is on the resume and what is like in the actual job description may not be elucidated anywhere, right? So, is there a story you can give me where you've had a challenge that seemed unwinnable, or people thought was an obstacle couldn't be made, and you and your team figured a way around it, and how did you do
Yeah.
it? And really, I think the key thing that you're trying to get at is like, what is the thought process? Like, what is the logic you use to kind of break that down into chunks that could be actually managed by you and your team?
I have a mentor that talks about a resume as your marketing document and your interview as your sales opportunity. So,
Spot on. Spot
very
on.
different things. So, let's talk about your unique perspective coming from that recon background and then thinking about what cybersecurity threats do you believe are underestimated from startups today? Um, you know, Maybe it's AI, maybe it's something else, and maybe recommendations on how you would address those, how you would think about those threats.
I think it's easy. And I think a lot of things are right now immediately jump to like quantum AI and things like that. But honestly, I think the answer is much more mundane than that, right? I think that what I've found more likely to startups is they have a great idea and they start to build that great idea and they start to sell that great idea, but they don't always think about securing it, right? And I think that in many cases, the basic foundational aspects of it, like, are you giving basic security training to your teammates? Are you, making sure they're not clicking on things, stuff like that? Do you have endpoint protection on the devices that are touching and open the internet, right? Are you putting multi-factor authentication on everything? I mean, like, just getting some of those super simple basics knocked out knocks out a significant threat portion. I think what I've seen a lot of times in startups is this perspective of like, oh, I'm too small. I don't have to worry about this. Or, oh, like, we'll get to that at a certain point. Um, when you think more broadly about startups, right, you have to do three things. You have to build, you have to sell, you have to secure. And I think if that ultimately needs to be made into a concentric circle, I think the more often the challenge is it's in startups, it's very heavily in the build phase, and that sell and that secure part is kind of a stretched chain Venn diagram that isn't quite aligned. And I'd encourage startup founders to think about, like, from the start, how do I make that one circle and one approach, and really just getting the foundational pieces right is really critical and knocks out 80% of the threats.
Yeah. So that hygiene, doing the basics, sounds like it shrinks the attack surface a bit, and it certainly makes it less of an easy target. You're never too small to be attacked. Um,
Yeah, and I think the way you said it, I think attack surface is the right way to think about it, right? Every
mhm,
time you add in a new feature or piece, like, like I think General Cartwright once said, if there's an aperture, it's a target, right? When you think about like
mhm.
how the military moves. So, you know, if you have a sensor on the battlefield that is collecting information, that is an actual vector, that is an attack service that may not be able to be like, you're not going to drop malware into it, but you can manipulate that. You can send information in there, and that's a version of a cyber attack, right? So being aware of what that attack surface is, and as you add features in, understanding how that attack surface is changing. Um, Honestly, just turning things into known unknowns, vice unknown unknowns, is a critical step when you're evaluating your next steps as a startup.
So, do you ever turn that sort of thinking where you say, like, what are the apertures that we've added, and come back at your own business, red team it a bit, and help educate the startup founders that you're working with on that concentric circle that are thinking maybe build and sell, and you're responsible for the secure portion, and to bring them along as a partner to see, like, this is what the outside world would see when they were going to attack us.
That's a great point. I think the piece that, with some of the startups I work with, that try to do exactly that, right? I think security does itself a disservice when it becomes antagonistic or like the police, internal police for the organization. It's just like when you run a phishing campaign and someone clicks. How you respond to that is really the critical thing, right? Like, you treat it as an education opportunity. Do you engage them in a positive manner, or is it some type of like, stick-based punishment piece? It's always better to go with the incentive, right? And then
Mhm.
show them why. But I think also from a security standpoint, you have to be mindful of the business issues. I think I've had cases in startups where we found an issue and a concern. But when we evaluated the cost associated with remediation or even transferring that risk, the decision was like, okay, we know about it, but like, we're gonna accept it. We have no choice based on the circumstances. And I think as a security professional, you have to be smart about how you categorize that to leadership and then take them along as best they can. So they're making the best decisions. I think most of the cases where there's been failures there is because you didn't educate people right on the decision making process and give them the information they need. I mean, I saw this in the military, right?
Absolutely. So it sounds to me like it's a communication as much as anything. Right there along with the education. You don't want to go in and name and shame, and you certainly want to give somebody the ability to make the trade off, right? Speed, security, where we're going to focus or not focus at a given moment. There's no such thing as 100% pure security at any time.
And if it is 100% secure, it's totally unusable, right? I mean, I think
Right.
that's the whole thing. I think if you come in as a security leader and try to crank that rheostat all the way to security, it's going to kill the business, right? But
Yeah.
if the business is all the way on the other side of convenience, then it's also super dangerous. It's like everything you're kind of constantly trying to dial that in to be as secure as you can, but while maintaining that. I mean, like, we had a very recent case where in our company where something was brought up and the security perspective was like, that needs to be shut down, and that's fine. But like, you need to ask before you turn that off, what is the use case? What is the reason for that first? And make sure you're doing supplementary pieces. I mean, I can give you a great example of that from when I was on military recruiting, where there was a many years ago, there was a threat which was transmitted through USB drives, and the decision made from the DoD is like turn off all USB drives in the military, shut down auto run, can't use external drives or external devices, and totally understand that from a security standpoint, totally legitimate call. But in recruiting duty, like we had the need to like have applicants sign documents. We had to upload pictures of their tattoos. So very quickly, you had this case where a recruiter has to get this contract signed to meet his or her mission for the end of the month. And so they were taking personal cameras and then putting it on their own devices, then emailing it to a side thing, and then burning it to a disk and sticking to a standalone computer, and then transferring it. So they were taking like 7 or 8 steps, but still getting the data back onto the military network.
Yeah.
Like, is that more secure or less secure than
It
just
sounds like they opened up the attack surface just a smidge.
yeah, just a smidge? So I
Yeah.
think you always ask like, why are you using this in the first place before you turn it off, right?
Yeah. Years ago, I was talking to Roland Cordier when he was with ADP, and he was
Hmm.
describing security as an ingredient in the business, right? And security was a quality ingredient. I think from a chef point of view, if you put too much of any quality ingredient in it, all of
It's
a sudden
fair.
it just tastes like a spice, right? You've got to get that mix just right so that you've got a quality ingredient in there, but it doesn't overpower as a flavor. So Donnie, let's transition for a second to thinking about the contrast between military and private sector.
Hmm.
You went from military; it's maybe a touch more hierarchy, and then you're at a tech startup. I'm wondering how you navigated the cultural differences, the operational differences, and then what is your leadership approach in those two environments, and what did you take from the military and apply to the startup space?
They're probably more. I don't want to belie the cultural difference because there are significant cultural differences, right? Um, but I think in many ways there's some more similarities than people realize because I think there's initial perspective of like, oh yeah, the military is very hierarchical. The commanding officer just says do this, and everybody follows those orders. But in practice, it's very different. That hierarchical structure is designed for one specific goal, which is ruthless efficiency in a combat situation where people's lives are on the line, where you don't have the time to explain the why, you don't have the time to have a conversation, you just have to execute. But if you're in a garrison environment, a non-critical environment, people's lives aren't on the line, and you lead with that approach, you're kind of just a jerk, right? And it plays out very quickly in the military, right? So I think that when we were in combat, certainly there are points where we just had to say, "Shut up and color. We're doing this." But when you weren't in that, or you weren't in that high pressure situation, it was really critical as a leader to actually sit down and talk to the whole range of individuals in your command and hear their perspectives and understand their perspectives and integrate that into your decision making. I think I lucked out a little bit on the cultural transition because I had several roles which were very different than a standard piece. I mentioned recruiting already, where you were very distributed, like remote before remote was really a thing, where you would have an individual recruiter who's by himself, a sergeant sitting in a mall by himself, 4 hours away from his boss, who's another 2 hours away from me. And how do you manage that type of leadership where you're not seeing everybody on a daily basis? Recon is a similar thing where you're leading very small, highly capable teams. And even as the commander, I was not the expert in everything they did. So I had to be very cautious and very engaging to understand what their experiences were, what they needed on the ground. Because if you think about like what a normal military organization needs, as opposed to like a six-man team that has to be out of radio comms and is only doing communications windows, is going to have to make decisions without ever being able to ask for permission or guidance. How do you communicate the left and right lateral limits for that team to operate freely and engage?
Inside the military, it's like really mission driven.
Mhm.
And in one of those things that I think can actually like bring people together. I have felt that same sense of mission inside of cybersecurity. It's
Agree.
in service of something greater than my next achievement and professionally and or a paycheck. And I'm wondering how you've brought that sense of service from the military into your current role, or if it's something that's just naturally there across our industry.
Yeah, I think it is certainly more naturally there in cybersecurity as opposed to other industries. And I think certainly if you look at my time when I was running startups, I struggled a little bit culturally with that, right? Because the real goal was like drive product and make a profit. And that just does not appeal a lot of times to folks leaving the military. I think what got me up every day in those roles is, just what you said is in the cybersecurity side. Look, I'm protecting my team, I'm protecting our customers. And even if you take a look at the product, I was like, I could get behind that because when I talk to developers who are using that product, it was making their lives significantly better and allowing them to focus on the things they wanted to focus on. So I think you have to figure out what is that aspect of mission that you can get behind about how, and it often relies on, are you protecting another person? Or are you making their lives better? I think in cybersecurity, that's a lot easier to wrap your head around. In our current role at Second Front, because we're a public benefit corporation, we can kind of like look at that very clearly. Mission means a lot more and a lot deeper than just making the profit, right? We're focused on how we actually take care of warfighters down the road. But totally agree. I think, and that's a cultural thing for the military is where are you going to find that kind of mission satisfaction? I think my experience is you do find that in cybersecurity for exactly the reasons you said.
It's a really interesting thread. Like it's an unintended consequence. And I find that sometimes
Mm.
government policies have these unintended consequences.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, when you look at the overall aspects of these cybersecurity rules, I mean, like the intent is good, right? Is to make things safer and secure and to hold people
Hmm.
accountable. I think the challenge is exactly what you kind of hit upon is there's multi-generational consequences and impacts to that I think are um, not always considered. And it's hard to forecast, to be fair. So, what a lot of CISOs are concerned about now is, okay, how does it impact me? And also, how's my company working with me to protect me if we do have a breach, we do have an issue, which in the security world, we just kind of accept that that's kind of a natural course of doing business. Like, we're going to do our best, we're going to defend as hard as we can, but we're dealing with pretty significant threats out there, and someone may get in. And if that happens, like, is that going to impact my family, my livelihood long term? Because I'm going to be going into court over it. And I think there's certainly aspects, and I don't want to get into specific cases where maybe someone did certain things wrong and all, but it's driving a very different experience for CISOs applying to jobs and asking questions about, am I on the company's insurance policy? Like, am I officially an officer of the company? Like, who is
Right.
responsible for these things? And I think those questions were not asked as directly, certainly in more SMB type CISO roles. But I think we've had a lot of experienced CISOs now that are having to step back, and I've seen roles stand out there for major companies go unfilled for months on end. And I have to kind of like do the math and say on the backside, there are some people that I know would apply for those, but they're kind of skeptical. Like, if I step in this role or this company just had an incident, just fired their CISO, like, is that really something I want to walk into? And how is that going to impact me long term? And I think some are using that as negotiating leverage on how they approach these jobs, but I think others are, I want to sit it out a little bit and just see how these rules and these court cases kind of settle so I have a better sense of how to approach it.
Yeah. So maybe the unintended consequence of the SEC cyber rule would be that some folks are taking a step back or slow rolling it. But I also wonder if maybe it's forcing a maturation to the role where you're asking more
Yeah.
business oriented questions.
I think that's also fair. I mean, I remember Royal Hansen, at Google, he was an advisor to our program. And I remember, years ago when we first started the program, it was like 2017, he was talking to the class about cybersecurity and risk and saying, you know, we think of cybersecurity sometimes as like just this computer problem or this IT problem or this, protect the servers problem. But really it is business risk. And I think I've seen that in a lot of companies where you talk about what is the actual risk we're dealing with. And really, legal teams, finance teams, and cybersecurity teams are the only verticals in a business that truly deal with and understand risk,
Yeah.
and understand how those processes work and to think about it. And I think the more we go forward is like you do need to integrate businesses, right? And you can't be the CISO that's crying wolf all day, but you can't be the one that misses something that sinks the business. So
Yep.
I think I always look at the perspective as like I never want to be caught by something that I didn't foresee. If we identified it and we raised it and we discussed it and we made a decision to accept the risk, that's really the job. And then how it plays out from there, you just do your best to kind of close things out as much as you can.
Yeah. Sometimes the best that you can do is recover. Let's talk about those SEC cyber rules. Have you observed any significant impacts to companies' strategies for managing and reporting cyber risks?
Yeah, I think the real piece that I think people are struggling with is, obviously this really focuses on public companies who have like, 10K and 8K reporting requirements.
Right.
I think it's really understanding like when you talk about disclosure, um, how do you phrase that and how do you address that, right? Because this becomes a challenge. If you say, oh, we have a policy for this, there's plenty of companies and startups and other companies I've seen where they write a policy that meets maybe a SOC 2 or ISO requirement, but are they actually enforcing that policy? Are they managing it? And if you're reporting that to the SEC, you're pretty damn sure that your employees have read that policy and you're enforcing it and managing it, the whole life cycle of it, not just like doing a paper drill. I think that also gets in when you start talking about one thing that I am seeing is like certainly on the cybersecurity government side is boards suddenly thinking very carefully like how do we bring and even though that wasn't a finalized rule that we have to have cybersecurity experience at the board, um, changing how they look at that, right? Either bringing in cybersecurity experience to the board or making sure the board at least talks to the CISO or the representative on a quarterly basis or more. So I do think that that's one positive thing is cybersecurity issues are being discussed now in boards much more commonly, and I think it will be increasing down the road. But I think the last thing that I think is really probably the hardest piece here is the reporting requirements and the disclosure requirements around a cyber incident, how you're defining a cyber incident, and specifically the materiality of the incident, because that's always the company's evaluation. And I think that's where you start getting a super weird risk category, which we'll see down the road, where something happens, the company says that's an event, not an incident. We don't think it has material impacts that merit reportability or disclosure. And then down the road, maybe that metastasizes and expands out. And then it comes
Right.
back like, why didn't you report that? And that is a very common incident in cybersecurity.
Yeah, you'd have a class of investors that would come back and say that they were damaged and they have a case, and
Exactly.
that's what the SEC is there to enforce. And yet at the time when you're looking at it from, in the moment or just after, you may not have been able to anticipate the sort of knock-on effects that are there. I was talking to Jacqueline Wadika about this, and in that specific ambiguity right now will work itself out in the courts, but it is a risk, right? It is one of those things that's tough to anticipate which of those would you say incidents to events, events to incidents is going to be material later on.
Yeah, and
Um,
you have the risk of a company over-reporting and that having profound impacts on their company value, right? Which has a
right.
different perspective of investor
Reputational
concerns,
risk.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just,
So it's again, where are you dialing that in at? And that's a really hard decision to make.
yeah, that's an interesting perspective of like if you over report and you drive down your share price or the value of the company, is that actually as big of a concern of, you had an event and underreported it? Either way, investor is looking at where's my value and did
Right.
you as an officer as you put out earlier, did you drive that right? Let's wrap up with a couple of questions that I have about transitioning from being a veteran into security or tech.
Mhm.
We'll maybe make this one the lightning round.
Mhm.
So veterans aspire in entering into the cybersecurity field.
Yeah.
What foundational skills do you recommend developing first?
I would say beyond skills, I would say qualities and specific pieces out. And I would specifically say curiosity, right? You have to come in and be curious about it because if you're the type of person that's going to be curious about something, ask a question and pull a string, that's going to take you down roads that you would not have guessed otherwise. And I mean, for me, it was like I could order something on Amazon. I had no idea what happened when I pressed that button. So like I wanted to know, like, how does that all work in the background? If you're willing to ask that question, identify an answer, and then just pull the string and take it all the way down to the root, and do that a few times, you're going to quickly start identifying things that you're interested in, you're excited about, and that's going to really drive what skills or certification you develop around that curiosity.
I imagine that when you pulled on that, you found some bubble gum, some duct tape, and some real human ingenuity on bringing those systems together.
Yeah, I mean,
Uh,
I'll just say briefly, like that old XKCD cartoon about like dependencies and frameworks in a house of cards. Like, I think that's the biggest learning when you get into cybersecurity and software is you realize like how it really is kind of a house of cards. Whereas before, when I didn't know it, like everything looks so shiny and beautiful in the front end, like the back end is very, very different, right?
Yep. Front end UI is gorgeous. Back end, wow. Can you recommend any specific programs, certs, resources that helped you transition from military to tech based career?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's several of them out there, and I think one when you talk certifications, Syracuse University has a spectacular veterans program called Onward Opportunity O2O, and what that allows people to do is pick a certification they're interested in, and they will fund. a they'll fund the training course and the certification costs for one certification for every veteran, right? So identifying once you pull that string, you say, you know what, everyone who is in that role has CISSP or like a specific thing like that. You can pull that string and actually like get that funded. There's a number of other bespoke programs. I think the biggest thing I would say is like go out and find another thing out there because the base transition program the military offers is very, very basic and only gets you the basic foundation. So things like Hiring Our Heroes fellowships, the DoD Skill Bridge program. Um, I went through a program through the Commit Foundation, which talked about transitioning and thinking really deeply about what is your why and what is behind what you're thinking of. Kind of what we're talked about mission. But I'd encourage you find a program out there. There are a lot of military programs, and then try to identify like if you identify where you want to go, find individuals in the private sector to be a mentor and like look at what their career, their certifications, their skills look like. The odds are you can find a path to get those in that transition period. But I think the danger sometimes is you get out and you're like, oh, I'm going to get an MBA. I'm going to get PMP. I'm going to do this. Like, don't go down that road until you've actually gotten data to show it lines up to what you want to aspire to.
Transitioning, I got to imagine that's a bit daunting. Motivational advice for veterans that are interested in tech, but still deciding whether to take that first step.
I think I tie this to the networking aspect, right? Is when you leave the military, like you only have a very narrow window of what is out there. And I always tell people like there is a role that is at the right comp level that works for your family and balance in the right location. It's the perfect role for you. You just don't know where it is and how to get there yet. And the only way you do that is to talk to people. And I think that my experience in that was that I often found roles or companies that I absolutely did not want to do. That was easier to find than ones I did want to do. So I think that what I would say is if you say, oh, I want to be a project manager, like, do you know what that means? Go on LinkedIn, go find a former Marine or former veteran who is in project management and call them out and say, hey, I'm a fellow veteran or I'm a fellow graduate of such and such university. Like, we have a virtual coffee. I just like, tell me about what your job is like. Because if
Absolutely.
you do that, you'll quickly find like, you know what, maybe I didn't want to do that. Or wait, that sounds really cool. Let me see if I can pull that string a little more.
I think that putting your hand out there, people want to help, and then you've got a good sense of whether it's your jam or not. And if it is, that person is likely in a position to help recommend you or connect you to maybe they don't have that job, but they know where another one is
They
at.
know someone.
Yeah, yeah. No,
Yeah, I mean,
that's
I throw the VC advice, right? You ask for advice, you get money. You ask for money, you get advice, right? It's the same sort of thing, right? Like,
yeah,
okay.
yeah. What's the most important thing that our listeners should remember from our conversation?
What I would pull out is just what we just talked about, because I think it applies much broader than to veteran transition. Is like nurture your curiosity, right? Because if you're in a cybersecurity role right now and something doesn't make sense and you're curious about it, you're going to dig into it and you're going to find things that elucidate business risk that you didn't know about. If you are searching for a role, find something you're interested in, you're curious about, and pull that string and see where it leads you because you'll get critical information about whether you want to do that or not. And I think more broadly, just when you think about the constant problems and constant changes um, we have in the cybersecurity industry, every day is different. There's always a new challenge. There's always something else out there. If you're trying to like just maintain the perimeter based off what you know right now, you're going to fail. So be open minded, draw on information, listen, be curious, because I think by doing that, it helps you solve a lot of the things we've spoken about.
So, Donnie, a couple of takeaways that I had, and I want to thank you for the conversation. It's been fascinating. And once again, here I am getting paid to learn and talk to people that are infinitely smarter than I am. But stay curious, talk to people, and remember that security is all about finding the right balance between things that are secure and what your business needs. And it's an opportunity to educate and then accelerate rather than clamp down.
Yep, spot on.
Donnie, thanks. Appreciate you. And maybe we'll have you back on the threat vector soon. I really
Thanks,
enjoyed
David.
the conversation.
Yeah, it was great to be here. Thanks so much.
As I close out today's episode, I'm struck by Donnie's journey. He went from recon in the Marine Corps to cybersecurity in the Valley. Today's conversation reinforced the need our industry has for disciplined leadership, strategic thinking, and a security mindset, something that seems to show up in those who've served. One of the most impactful moments in the conversation came when Donnie discussed the importance of nurturing a security-first mindset, not as an afterthought, but as a foundational principle for those in security. This approach isn't just about safeguarding data or infrastructure. It's about fostering an environment where security is integral to the product development process from day one. And it's a reminder that in the digital age, where the threats are ever evolving, a proactive security stance on security isn't just beneficial, it's essential for survival and success. I absolutely love the fact that Donnie highlighted the role that curiosity plays in security. This resonated deeply with me. This field is constantly shifting, and that requires us to be inquisitive, to question assumptions, and to push boundaries. In reflecting on Donnie's insights, it's clear that the intersection of military discipline and cybersecurity expertise is not just about the transfer of tactical skills. It's about a mindset that views security as a mission-critical priority, a commitment to safeguarding the digital frontiers where our modern battles are increasingly being fought. If you're a listener, whether you're a veteran looking to transition into cybersecurity, a startup founder navigating the complexities of security in your venture, or already a cybersecurity professional, I hope Donnie's journey inspired you. To close this episode, I want to thank the Threat Vector team. Our executive producer is Michael Heller. Content and production by Shada Azimi, Sheila Drusky, Tanya Wilkins, and Danny Milrad. I edit the show, and Elliot Peltzman is our audio engineer. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Until then, stay secure, stay vigilant. Goodbye for now.